Why does God let bad things happen? It is perhaps the most challenging question hurled at the gates of faith. In times of personal grief, global crisis, or witnessing inexplicable cruelty, this question rises, raw and urgent, from the depths of human pain. If you believe in a God who is good, who holds the universe in his hands, who knows every sparrow that falls and every tear that is shed, then how do you reconcile that belief with the undeniable, often horrific reality of suffering and evil in the world? Why does an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God let bad things happen? It's a question that has troubled theologians, philosophers, and everyday believers for millennia, giving rise to the complex field known as theodicy, the attempt to justify the ways of God in the face of evil. The problem laid bare: at its heart, the problem is a perceived contradiction between God's attributes and the state of the world. The traditional monotheistic conception of God describes a being who is omnipotent, all-powerful, capable of doing anything logically possible; omniscient, all-knowing, aware of everything that happens or could happen; omnibenevolent, all-good, perfectly loving and desiring the well-being of creation. If such a God exists, the argument goes, then evil should not. If God is all-powerful, he can prevent evil. If God is all-knowing, he knows when and where evil is occurring. If God is all-good, he would want to prevent all evil. Yet evil exists in abundance. Therefore, either God lacks one or more of these attributes, or he does not exist as classically defined. The bad things we speak of are not trivial inconveniences. They encompass the profound suffering caused by war, famine, disease, natural disasters, betrayal, abuse, and the myriad ways humans inflict pain upon each other and experience hardship from the natural world. These are not just abstract concepts, they are lived realities of agony and loss that cry out for an explanation. Why does God allow the tornado to devastate a town? Why does God permit the child to suffer from a painful illness? Why does God not intervene to stop acts of unimaginable cruelty? Distinguishing the forms of evil. To approach the question of why God lets bad things happen, it helps to differentiate the sources of these bad things. As explored previously, evil is commonly divided into two categories. Moral evil. This stems from the free choices and actions of moral agents, primarily humans. When someone chooses to lie, cheat, hate, harm, or destroy, they introduce moral evil into the world. This includes individual acts of malice, as well as systemic injustices and the cumulative weight of human sin throughout history. Natural evil. This refers to suffering caused by natural processes that are independent of human will. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, hurricanes, droughts, diseases, genetic defects, predation in the animal kingdom. These events cause pain and death, but are not the direct result of a specific human's moral failing. Any satisfactory answer to why God lets bad things happen must grapple with both forms of evil, as they each pose distinct, though sometimes overlapping, challenges to a benevolent deity. Theological responses seeking reasons for permission. Religious traditions have offered various frameworks, theodicies, to understand why God might permit evil to exist, even if he does not directly cause it. These are not necessarily presented as God's explicit reasons, but as human attempts to construct logically coherent and theologically faithful accounts. The permission for free will. One of the most widespread explanations centers on the concept of free will. The argument here is that God, in his desire for a certain kind of relationship with his creation, chose to endow some beings, humans and perhaps others, with genuine freedom, the capacity to make real choices, including the choice between good and evil, love and hate, obedience and rebellion. Why God might permit evil through free will. The value placed on free will is often seen as inherent to the possibility of genuine love, authentic relationship, and meaningful moral action. Love that is forced is not love. Relationship that is predetermined lacks depth. Moral choices made under compulsion are not truly moral. Therefore, if God wanted beings capable of freely choosing to love him, to love each other, and to act righteously, he had to grant them the freedom to choose otherwise. The existence of moral evil is then understood as the tragic but unavoidable consequence of this freedom being misused by created beings. God lets this evil happen not because he desires it, but because preventing it would require removing the freedom necessary for the highest goods. It is argued that a world with free beings and the possibility of evil is ultimately more valuable in God's eyes than a world of unfree beings incapable of sin, but also incapable of freely chosen love and goodness. Handling different types of evil. This theodicy directly addresses moral evil. It explains why humans inflict terrible things upon each other, because they choose to. It struggles more acutely with natural evil. Some extensions suggest natural evil is a consequence of a corrupted creation due to the fall, humanity's original misuse of free will affecting the entire cosmos, or that a world governed by consistent natural laws, which can occasionally cause harm, is necessary for free will to operate meaningfully, e.g., knowing that fire burns allows us to freely choose to avoid it or use it responsibly. Challenges. Critics ask if an omnipotent God could have created beings who were genuinely free and who he knew would always choose the good. They question whether the immense scale of suffering caused by free will is justified by the value of freedom. The world as a place for soul-making. Another significant perspective is the soul-making theodicy, often called the Irenaean theodicy. This view proposes that God permits suffering because this world is designed as an environment for human spiritual development, character formation, and moral growth. Why God might permit evil for soul-making. This perspective sees humanity not as created perfect and then fallen, but as being created in God's image and currently in the process of growing into God's likeness. This growth, or soul-making, requires overcoming challenges, making difficult choices, and responding to adversity. Virtues like courage, compassion, patience, perseverance, and faith are not developed in a vacuum. They are forged in the crucible of struggle and suffering. God lets suffering happen, not as punishment, though it may feel that way, but as necessary conditions for our spiritual and moral maturation. A world without pain, struggle, or the possibility of failure would, in this view, stunt our growth and prevent us from developing into the kind of beings God intends us to become. Handling different types of evil. Both moral and natural evil can be seen as contributing to this process. Witnessing moral evil can call us to compassion, justice, and resistance. Experiencing natural evil can foster resilience, mutual aid, and a deeper reliance on faith. Difficulties of all kinds provide opportunities to develop virtues. Challenges. A major challenge is the problem of gratuitous evil. Suffering that appears so excessive, random, or destructive that it seems impossible to see any meaningful spiritual growth resulting from it. Does soul-making justify the suffering of infants, or those whose lives are ended or utterly broken by trauma before any development seems possible? Critics argue that a loving God would not design a system that requires such immense pain for growth, or that at least some suffering seems disproportionate to any conceivable developmental outcome. The consequence of a fallen world. Drawing heavily from interpretations of the biblical narrative, particularly the story of the fall in Genesis, the Augustinian theodicy, in one of its forms, posits that evil is not part of God's original good creation, but entered the world through the misuse of freedom by created beings, both angelic and human. Why God might permit evil as a consequence. In this view, God created a perfect, harmonious universe. Sin, understood as a turning away from God, disrupted this perfect order. The suffering and evil we see are the natural, logical consequences of this disruption, a world no longer perfectly aligned with God's will. God lets this happen because it is the just consequence of sin. Moral evil is directly attributed to human sinful choices. Natural evil is sometimes explained as a consequence of the fall's impact on the entire created order, which is now subject to decay, disorder, and disharmony because of sin, e.g., Romans 8:22 speaks of creation groaning. God's permission is tied to the consequences of creaturely actions. Handling different types of evil. This theodicy strongly links evil to sin and the state of a fallen world. It sees suffering as a result of humanity's rebellion, either directly, moral evil, or indirectly, natural evil as a consequence of the brokenness introduced by sin. Challenges. This view faces difficulties in explaining the origin of the first sin in a perfect creation. Why would perfectly good beings choose to turn away from perfect goodness? It also raises complex questions about inherited guilt and the justice of individuals suffering today for an original sin committed generations ago. Furthermore, attributing all natural evil solely to the fall is questioned by modern scientific understanding of natural processes that predate humanity or seem independent of human action. Beyond the explanations, mystery, presence, and hope. While these theodicies offer structured ways of thinking about why God lets bad things happen, it's crucial to acknowledge that for many, the answer lies not solely in intellectual justification, but in other aspects of faith. The limits of human understanding. Some religious perspectives emphasize the inherent limitations of human understanding when attempting to comprehend the mind and purposes of an infinite God. Perhaps there are reasons for the existence of suffering that are simply beyond our finite capacity to grasp. This is not a formal theodicy, but a stance of humility and trust in the face of mystery. It suggests that while we may not know why God permits a specific evil, we can still trust in His character and ultimate plan, even when it is opaque to us. God's presence in suffering. For many believers, the most profound response to suffering is not finding a reason for it, but finding God within it. The idea of a God who is not distant but who enters into human suffering, who knows pain and loss personally, as central to Christian belief in the crucifixion, offers solace and a sense of solidarity. While this doesn't explain why the suffering happened, it addresses the existential agony by assuring the sufferer that they are not alone and that God understands their pain from the inside. The promise of ultimate restoration. Many religious traditions offer a vision of ultimate justice and restoration, where evil will be finally defeated and suffering redeemed or overcome. This eschatological hope doesn't explain why evil was permitted in the first place, but it provides a framework of meaning and purpose within the larger narrative of creation, fall, redemption, and ultimate renewal. It suggests that the current suffering, however terrible, is not the final word, and that God's ultimate plan involves overcoming all evil. The ongoing conversation. The question, why does God let bad things happen, is not one with a single easy answer that silences all doubt and comforts all pain. Religious thought offers several complex and sometimes overlapping explanations, primarily centering on the value God places on free will, the purpose of the world as a place for spiritual growth, or the consequences of sin in a fallen world. Each of these theodicies attempts to construct a coherent narrative that allows for the coexistence of a good, powerful God and the reality of evil. However, the experience of suffering is deeply personal and often resists purely intellectual explanations. For many, the answer is found not just in why God permits evil, but in how God is present in suffering, how faith provides resilience and hope, and how the community of believers supports one another through darkness. Ultimately, engaging with this question is a fundamental part of the religious journey. It requires intellectual honesty, emotional vulnerability, and a willingness to sit with mystery. While the search for understanding continues, faith often finds its footing not in having all the answers, but in trusting the character of God even when His purposes remain hidden in the face of a world filled with both beauty and heartbreaking pain.